Hey guys, welcome back to the Powerlifters Programming Podcast. Very special guest today, Ben Esgro. I'm going to let Ben give himself a quick background. He's done a lot of podcasts with the supplement industry, but I just want him to touch a little bit on that, and then also mainly on like the training, coaching side in case you guys aren't familiar. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you. So yeah, that's probably the hardest question or preface you're going to give me all day, I think, because one thing I'm not great at is talking about myself. I could talk about concepts and facts and everything else. You'll see I can give TED Talks on that, but myself is kind of the hardest. So I guess the shortest elevator pitch is that I started powerlifting. I actually came from bodybuilding. The roots of a lot of modern fitness, people who are kind of authority figures now, the roots really were bodybuilding.com forums. Now that is really Instagram. That was like the original social media. And so I started on there as a bodybuilder. I was heavily influenced by Lane Norton. Ultimately, I started to coach him. I still do now as a master's lifter. I handle him. I used to do his coaching and handling. But early on, a lot of natural bodybuilders were starting to powerlift to do something in the off season. If you look back all the way to the roots of fitness, you see that common theme of a lot of even, Arnold era, the classic era bodybuilders were powerlifting and doing a lot of strength training. So that kind of became a thing in what I call the fitness renaissance, which was back in, I guess, around 2010, maybe a little bit before that. Obviously, Lane was heavily influential. He still is. So when he started doing that, a lot more people started doing that. And I just found that I loved powerlifting. I loved the quantitative, objective judgment of it more than I did the subjective judgment of it. And that basically you really have to learn programming to become better at that. Whereas I think you can make a pretty good case that it helps to know programming in bodybuilding, but a lot of it is recycling of, kind of chasing the pump or just concepts that are based a lot more around feel. And that just wasn't fulfilling for me. So I got way into powerlifting. I started competing and just loved training. So I trained, I think probably something that will be woven throughout this entire conversation was a lot of things came from my self-experimentation in training. So once I was not able to compete anymore because I had a pretty serious back injury, I started coaching more. And if you look at my contest history, you could make a really strong case that I was a lot more effective of a coach than a lifter. So I think I sort of stumbled into that role. Whereas, and this, I promise I'll finish here, is for me, the intent was always as an athlete and a lifter to manufacture myself as a world champion, because I never was naturally the strongest guy. Like I got pinned by 135 on bench pounds. For the whole first year I trained, it took me another 2 or 3 years to bench 225, another 3 or 4 to bench 315. So I knew I was going to have to figure something out to make myself stronger and more competitive. So I think by putting myself through the ringer, it gave me a very objective knowledge of where the cutoffs are and where things are, excessive and too much versus where, fear kind of stops people from pushing as hard as they need to. I'll stop there.
No, that was awesome. And you really did that with training others to world championships, world records, all sorts of things. Do you want to mention like some athletes that you've helped coach?
Sure. So I think the most prominent and really, where I'd have to admit where I was put on the map, and if I were to self-describe, I think I got too much authority too fast. Don't get me wrong, I'm very appreciative for it, but I think because Lane is such a high-profile person, I felt like I was immediately put like on a lot of people's radars before I really earned it. So Lane was really the first one where I think I got a lot of attention for coaching him and him making it to Worlds, getting second at Worlds, winning a bunch of national championships. And then through Lane performing so well, I think a lot of other powerlifters kind of got, you see this is a very common recycling in the powerlifting space, is if you coach a high profile athlete, you do well with them, you tend to get, this gravity where it just draws people to you because it's street credit, right? Or street credibility. So it started with Lane, and then I coached one of his competitors at the time, LS McLean. I was able to coach him to some bench world records. And then Eli Burks won a world title, won a bunch of national championships. I had a client, Lisa Randazzo, who won worlds. Taylor Atwood, that was kind of how the Jason and I story, that could be its own podcast, but the really short version of it was when Nationals was in my hometown. We had a team for my prior supplement company, De Novo Nutrition, and Taylor was on our team as a sponsored athlete for the supplement company. Jason was there as his coach. I ended up kind of working alongside Jason that day because things, as they often do, went a little bit off the rails, and we worked together and we just had such good rapport that I started that I told him at the end of the day, I don't know when, but I know we'll work together again at some point. And here we are now. Like I'm a partner in the business of the Strength Guys. But then we ended up working together with Taylor after he lost Worlds to actually Chell. And you know, that story is history. We were able to have a lot of success in co-coaching Taylor, getting him to really be of that period one of the most dominant powerlifters. And I guess more recently, I've had a couple bench national champions who compete on the world stage. I have a lifter who I'm not specializing in bench press. This is just kind of by luck of the draw what I've gotten. A lifter who just broke the world record at 105 in bench. And yeah, like I said, it's hard for me off the cuff to remember all of these. I'm sure I apologize if there's some I'm forgetting, but it's been a while. I mean, when I look back, it's kind of hard for me to think that I started training 20 years ago and really have been coaching for 15 years. And now I actually just looked at my folder. It's been over 1,000 people I've coached. So it's crazy. I don't feel that old, but everything on paper says I am. So unfortunately, I guess I'm gonna have to believe it.
Yeah, I guess so. That's quite the roster. Over 1,000 people is really cool. I think it's cool to like look at science and see studies and stuff, but like you've got your own science research studies from 1,000 people. So like being in the game that long with coaching is going to just provide great value to everything else we talk about. You were talking about a bit earlier, and you were saying you came from bodybuilding into the powerlifting scene, which I also like the objectiveness of powerlifting a ton too. Whenever you first came into the powerlifting scene, can you kind of talk about how people were training at that point, and then how that kind of evolved and how you found out the type of training that worked better?
Sure. Yeah, so there has definitely been a quantum shift in what I'd say the perspective of good training is, or you could say the status quo of what it is. At that time, Westside was huge. So a lot of people were doing a lot of speed work, a lot of band stuff. And then pretty high volume, moderate frequency programs became very popular. You know, the Smolovs, the Chicos, that's kind of all that was really out there. Like 531 was a very fundamental, popular program, but a lot of people ran templates and just reported their results on that. And that's kind of what became popularized. But I think the most influential to me when I ran it and then really saw other people run it and then ran it myself were the Smolovs and the Smolov juniors. And that's really what was eye-opening to me. There was really two extremely eye-opening periods for me in my own training. And then I guess that influenced my training philosophy. Sorry, there's three. I'm going to try not to forget them. That influenced my coaching philosophy very heavily because it was just so clear, the patterns there, that it was impossible to deny. So I'd say the first one was watching a lot of people run Smolov and just make that magnitude of progress in their squat in such a short period of time. Now, something that may or may not come up again in the conversation is dose response. That's that's an enormous thing that just can't be escaped, and it's true of all facets of life. It's from my other professional area, which is pharmacology and supplements. It's extremely true there. It's extremely true in another facet that I work in, which is nutrition, and same thing in programming. Like, people want to believe that they can get more out of less, and I think it's more so that better is better, not necessarily more is better. Better is better, and sometimes more might be necessary to keep the progress moving. I do think a good shift is that people started asking, am I doing more than I need to make progress? But I think oftentimes we have these extreme swings, and people want to swing it back too far. Like, there's the oftentimes the correct answer is somewhere in the middle. So I think during that time, a lot of people ran Smolov. It was mind blowing to see people put 50 to 100 pounds on their squat within, 2 months, 2 to 3 months, sometimes even less. And it was just eye opening to me. So the first thing is like, man, that's an enormous even for today's standard. That's enormous gains in such a short period of time. Now, obviously, a lot of people wouldn't be able to finish the program because of overuse injuries, because of the dose being that extreme. The reality is, yes, you do adapt or you die, but considering Smolov, sometimes you'll feel like you might want to or you're going to die, but I think the body is a lot more resilient than people think. Now, you may have some negative adaptation as well, which is like tissue changes with tendons and ligaments and discs and stuff like that, but muscle is an amazingly plastic tissue, and the nervous system is amazingly adaptable. So I think, and sorry, I'm running off a little bit. I will get back. I do tangent a bit, so just bear with me. I think there's this major fear of an ill-defined concept where back in my period, it was overtraining. And for people today, it's like fatigue, too much fatigue. It's like the fatigue boogeyman. The reality is that at some point, training is going to fatigue you. You shouldn't be fatigued on contest day, but training will be, it is going to create a deficit. If you look at the fitness fatigue model, that is part of super compensation. So anyway, to kind of get back to the point, I think what really opened my eye during that period is when people talked about squatting more than twice a week not being possible for a natural lifter, and then you have people doing it 4 days a week, really heavy and making these enormous gains. It was like, something doesn't add up here. There's a misconception. Somebody's wrong, and if these people consistently keep getting stronger, I don't think it's the less is more crowd. So that was really fascinating to see. Then running it myself was very eye-opening, and I think the most eye-opening part was when I was doing both bodybuilding shows and powerlifting at the same time. And I have this old video on YouTube that I think it might be private. I kind of go back and look at it just for my own entertainment sometimes. I tested my lifts after training. I trained 7 days a week. I did double sessions Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then I trained classical power sessions on the days in between, which was like 50% one, 30 to 50% of one rep max, 3 to 5 reps, a lot of sets, but just moving really explosively, so I wouldn't dig the recovery deficit too large. And the questions that I needed to answer for myself were, can I get leaner without doing cardio? So basically have a more highly specific form of burning calories to the endpoint I want, which is keeping more muscle, staying more full, keeping my strength. And how much strength can I retain doing this? And the thing, I mean, it was, anyway, I tested in this video, and as soon as I re-racked the bar, I just screamed, what? Because I was so mind blown. Basically, I lost 35 pounds during that prep, and I think I only lost 10 pounds on my squat. So my relative strength went up like a mind-blowing amount. And it was like, okay, there's really something here to this high frequency, dose managed approach that was highly specific. So that sort of validated then that there's really something to this, not just in studies, there's really something to this high frequency high intensity, highly specific methodology of training. Then at that time, I became friends with Mike Zordos, who is a professor at FAU. He was just starting some of the research now that has been out for a while that kind of validated a lot of our concepts. And the last part to finish there is during that time as well, there was a lot of Olympic lifters doing squat every day training. So kind of working up to a conservative max and then doing back offsets. And there was a guy named John Brose who had a gym, I think, in Vegas. He trained a popular Olympic lifter at that time who was squatting every day and breaking a lot of records. And he basically framed it in a way that I think is the simplest way you could put it. That's not non-technical. It's completely common language, which is, if your family was held hostage and you had to increase your squat to get them to free them, what would you do? How would you train? Would you squat once a week, or would you squat every day, or would you squat more frequently? I think most people would be like, I'm going to do anything I'm going to squat more frequently. So, yeah, I think it pushed a lot of those boundaries and concepts. And I'm very much an experimenter. In order for me to believe something, I need to have my observations line up with what the study says, what the consensus opinion is, and I would say I was heavily influenced by programs like that, because it was just that undeniable how much progress you could create in a short period of time. Now, obviously, there is a drawback to that, but if you really want to create fast progress in a short period of time, high frequency, high intensity, high specificity really work wonders.
Yeah, that was really great. I think that lays like a really good foundation of kind of like what you believe. And Jason said you really influenced him heavily and kind of framed his whole idea of how he trains everyone now. I think a lot of people have some like misconceptions about maybe what you're saying and how you guys do things, or maybe don't understand it fully. So I'm just going to list off some questions for you one at a time. And then if we get like just your response to them or like clear things up. So if like you're first working with an athlete and they are following a different system, how do you find that initial dose without like just, you're probably not giving them small off day one and saying good
Absolutely.
luck. Yeah. So how are you find that initial dose if someone's just doing like a different kind of training style?
Yeah, so I think really if you want sustainability and safety, you have to have incremental exposure. So basically, the best analogy I could use of something a lot more relatable and superficial is like if you were going to try to get more tan and you had somebody come to you and they are super pale, you're not going to be like, all right, just go stand outside all morning, don't put anything on your skin, and that'll work. Obviously that dose is so extreme from their baseline that it's just way too much. Like you're going to have maladaptation, which is they're going to burn. They're not going to get any of the desired adaptation. They'll burn, they'll peel. So when someone comes from a new system, initially I'm just trying to determine kind of their baseline level of their thresholds. So I'll try to work from a small increment up from what they were doing. So let's say they come to me and they were squatting 2 days a week. I might start them squatting 3 days a week, but only a slight increase in total sets for that week. And then I'm really going to stay there. As long as they're making progress, I'm going to stay at that frequency and roughly at that volume until they don't anymore. Again, I'm going to incrementally expose them, just like you would if you're progressively trying to get darker skin. You would go outside maybe for a half hour in the beginning. You'd get a little bit darker, not burn, and then you give yourself a little bit of time to recover, and then you'd slowly increase your exposure time. That's really what I'm doing. So I'm roughly trying to meet someone where they're coming to me frequency wise, but oftentimes increasing their specificity. A lot of people kind of come to me or us doing a lot more variations. As long as they're healthy and able, I'll kind of bring them in for max specificity. And just really in the beginning, have a very bare bones approach and see how they respond. And only then will I kind of start to increase things if they're not getting the desired response.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So really first you're introducing the specificity. Once I actually heard Jason, I think it was on a King of Lifts podcast, say, you can increase your squat with a pause squat, but every 100 pounds on your pause squat might be like 90 pounds on your competition lift. So if you want the full 100, you got to get that extra specificity in there. And then you're also just easing them into it, just going a little bit above. This obviously doesn't really apply to the real world, but if you had an athlete, some athletes are just super injury resistant. Are you of the belief that if you ease them into it and you slowly build them up, for a fact they're not going to get injured, that just more is always going to be better? Or is there kind of like a range of this athlete has to do 10 to 15 sets of squats a week, and then when that range stops working, then the range goes maybe like 15 to 20 sets a week? Or do you think if the athlete just pushes it super hard early on, they'll just get more progress from that, if you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think everybody's in a hurry, but in reality, there's no emergency. Like, powerlifting meets are going to keep happening. I realize everybody wants to chase the new records and the new totals and the new increases and everything. But I think that's the one trend I've seen is like everybody wants to get as fast as humanly possible in the shortest period of time. And I understand that. I lived through that myself. But the reality is you are asking for a high risk, high potential reward ratio from that, and the intervention is going to be that. So I think everybody wants a low risk, non-injury prone, high reward scenario, and the reality is that just doesn't really exist. So am I going to redline them with volume or intensity? I'm not, because the one thing that I've learned both through myself and through all of these people is you really can't manufacture an elite level lifter. You can certainly get everybody better and stronger. You can definitely get high level lifters to world champion level, but you're not going to take somebody who, like me, who couldn't bench 135 for the whole first year that they trained and get me a world record bench press in my class. Like, some barriers are insurmountable, and I think it's great that a lot of people don't want to believe that, and there are definitely coaches who will promise you that, but the reality is we just don't, practically we don't see that, and it's kind of irresponsible to try to push them to the point of breaking to create that. I think that's where really I think that's really where good coaching comes in, is communicating it in a way that is well received and ensuring people understand, like, this is what we can do, this is what is unrealistic and is more likely to hurt you. So to kind of go back to your question to make sure I answer it kind of completely, I am not trying to see the maximum somebody could handle, because I think you're answering a different question in writing somebody that intervention. Really, what I'm trying to find is what is the minimum amount we have to do to get the response that we are desiring here. And as long as you can incrementally keep making progress, I think that's the part that people fail to see, is oftentimes, I'll get a request of, like, I want to put 50 kilos on my total this year. And I've told people, if you look at, if this is an experienced lifter, if you look at the most experienced lifters out there, how often do you see that? Oftentimes you'll see a 5 to 10 kilo increase in total in a year for a really experienced lifter. If you take that over 5 years, that's huge progress. Most people are not making that progress at an elite level. So is what you're searching for actually realistic, or is it just a pipe dream that you will keep chasing your tail trying to find somebody to create for you? I think it's really, like, we have great databases now, like Open Powerlifting and things where you can really see and track people's progress. Like, I think that's a really useful thing for people to do, is like look at what rates of progress the elite lifters are making, and then really kind of use that as a benchmark for what are realistic expectations. But yeah, I don't think there's a lot to gain by seeing the maximum somebody could handle, because that's not what we're chasing in powerlifting. If we were chasing you know, thresholds for injury, then that would be a more appropriate programming style, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's smart. I mean, your job as a coach is to see what's the most they can lift over a career. And if you just give it all to them in the first, couple blocks of training, they're never going to make it through that whole career. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And would you define like your whole system? It sounds like athlete comes to you, you add a certain amount of workload, they stall, they need a little bit more, so you add a little bit more in that kind of fashion. Would you say that is just a requirement, just how the body works, got to add more over time? Or do you think it's more of like a system that TSG has adopted? There's other ways to like trick your body into progressing or whatever, and that's just a certain way? Or is that just like biological factor has to be done?
I think a lot of people, I think this is the difficulty in the fitness space, is a lot of people look at surface level details and think there's this overwhelming change happen when there's new trends happening. But the reality is the fundamentals never go out of style. Like specificity has always mattered. It still matters, hasn't gone away. To a certain degree, volume has always mattered, continues to matter, mattered then, matters now. You could argue more so for muscle hypertrophy, but we won't go down that rabbit hole for right now. Intensity really matters, has always mattered, will continue to matter over time. So any effective program is really manipulating those variables, whether they realize it or not. You can go back to the beginning of strength training up to modern day strength training. And that's the more interesting question to me, is what ties all of these things together? Why can multiple different programs at the surface level look so different but still be working? And the reality is when you dig deeper and look at them, they all have a high level of specificity. They all have an appropriate level. I call it, they have a high level of specificity of volume. So they're not just doing, push-ups to failure. You can accrue a ton of volume doing that. They're doing like incrementally more volume over time at the highly specific intensity range, above 85% for strength athletes. I think the misconception, and probably the major misconception for people of this training style, maybe more so before, but it still could be possible now, that people think is that we're just endlessly chasing volume and doing more volume. The reality is, if you get stronger and you rerun the same exact block, you're doing more volume. Like it's an inescapable mathematical fact. So, you don't always deliberately have to manipulate more sets, more reps to do more volume. If someone's getting stronger, you could, and you see this with people who run template programs. They'll keep running them until they don't get stronger off of them. At that point, maybe something needs to change. Maybe you do need to increase the amount of sets or something else. But I think that's a major misconception, is that we're just adding, mindlessly adding more sets or reps or anything like that. Like, a lot of times you can just let the progress drive the progressive overload.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you do the same sets, the same reps, the weight goes up, that's more tonnage. So it makes a ton of sense. Speaking of, actually, it's become pretty popular in the bodybuilding world mainly, that, and of course that's probably because they're going to higher exertions, but people say, oh, I'm doing X amount of sets per week. But I know something unique to TSG is you guys track tonnage, and you guys all seem extremely smart and extremely thought through clearly. So could you talk about why you do track tonnage instead of just sets a week?
So I think sets per week is not descriptive enough. It doesn't give you what's the word I'm looking for? I lose words often, and there's a perfect word for it. It's not robust enough. Like it doesn't explain in enough detail what's really happening in training, because like a set could be extremely easy. A set could be RPE 3, but you still, so are you going to weigh an RPE 3 equivalent to an RPE 8 set? Because you're just saying sets, right? There's no descriptor there. So we track volume, we track intensity, and then I kind of have a multiplier of like the volume times the intensity to get, you know, a marker of potency, as I've called it. Um, so I think I do think there's a point where you can get paralysis by analysis of measuring too much and measuring so much that you don't even know what you're measuring anymore and what's meaningful. But I do think you have to heavily weight things that we do have a pretty clear understanding of being important. And, you know, the one thing from working with Mike early on, we've known for a long time that volume, it's not the end all be all, but it matters. Same thing with intensity. So I think, you know, the heaviest weighted variables that we're tracking are volume, intensity, and we are tracking sets per week as well. But it's just that we don't stop at just sets per week. Like, you need a little more descriptive variable than that. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yeah, that definitely does. Like, if you have a technique day and you're just doing a 3x3 with 60% on like a tempo to work on some technique, and you add that as 3 sets, that's almost no work compared to your other day if you're doing sets of 5 at 80%. So I totally see your point there.
The weighting matters, because you can say I did 10 sets of push-ups today and that was 10 sets. Like, that's certainly not as equivalent even to loading up 50% of your 1 rep max on bench. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. It all kind of works within the context of each other. If you just have one on their own, it doesn't really paint the full picture. Kind of like what you're saying with volume and intensity. If you have the same amount of sets or the same amount of tonnage or whatever, and the intensity is changing, whether it's the weight on the bar or the RPE, that even is going to be a factor. But how do you go about adjusting the intensity? Is that something that over a lifter's career, you slowly scale up the RPEs and slowly scale up the like percent on the bar as you accumulate in volume? Or where do you kind of find is maybe like the sweet spot? I'm sure it depends, but how do you go about finding that sweet spot for a lifter of we're pushing their volume up, but like, is there a good RPE range, that sort of thing?
So I'm always trying to stay, assuming, because I know a large part of your audience are powerlifters. So assuming this is a powerlifter that I'm working with, I will stay within a much tighter. For me, I'm old school percentage. You can say RPE as well, though, whichever, that, you know, to a degree there's an interchangeability to those terms. I will keep them in a tighter percentage range. So like, I'm not really ever going to have a powerlifter train below 75% of 1 rep max. And I do like, that's one thing I like of the classical periodization model, of having a period where you do step back, and then you work towards the point where they're peaking. So you're not always training at, you know, 90+% or 9 RPE plus. That's a great way to wear yourself down. That it's, you know, I think you see a lot of people who have the career trajectory of a firework. You know, they can ascend really quickly for a short period of time, and then they sort of explode and fall back to earth, and then they might even leave powerlifting. I think if you want sustainability, it's important to have periods of time where you are working on maybe a little bit more technique work at a lower percentage, maybe a little bit more about growing muscle in certain areas, maybe a little more about if you are injury prone or you've had history of injury, maybe working on lower intensity support work. Sorry, my power plug fell out there. So it's very incremental over time. Really, I'm only riding that line when I'm peaking somebody. I'd say like the last 12 weeks of a prep for a meet is really when the RPEs or the intensity would be consistently highest, and the specificity would be highest as well. Oftentimes, I'm going to remove most of the any kind of auxiliary work or, you know, hypertrophy work or anything like that going into the meets, but I'm certainly not keeping somewhere there all year. I'm looking at, once I have enough data on somebody, I'm using their prior data to compare them against themselves. So like when we were at this percentage range, when I assessed you for strength levels, how does this compare now to where you were then? If that training block was an average intensity of 80%, like, am I still getting you stronger compared to the last data point? Obviously, when you compare someone to themselves, it's a lot more appropriate versus if you're assessing them compared to somebody else or some other standard, you know?
Yeah, definitely. So for powerlifters, you tend not to go below 75%, you said.
Yep.
And then they're actually prescribing that volume. I guess there's a lot of ways to do it. You could say, like, say that someone's 10 rep max. Would
Yep.
you lean more towards the side of, do a set of 10, go all out, or closer to, you could do 10 sets of one? Where do you kind of find the balance in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's an important part of context. So I'm happy you asked it. Um, I'd say about probably 3 or 4 years ago, we saw the trend and the philosophy, and also, to be honest, the work ethic of the average powerlifter changing. I'd say back in Lane's day, it was like put me in the dungeon and don't let me out until I can barely breathe. You know what I mean? Like the squat till you puke. There was posters for that. Like Animal had marketing on that. I do think that that has changed. Um, so we found that people were not wanting to do a lot of high rep sets. They weren't as willing. The buy-in wasn't there. So we kind of looked at how can we change, where are there faults in our philosophy and approach. So we did a basically self assessment and reached out to some people that we trusted, kind of interviewed them, asked them for their input on things, and then collected all of that and looked back at our approach and said, okay, how can we change this and potentially make it better, but not step it back in terms of its efficacy, make it sort of safer, more sustainable, and more digestible for where people are now. And what came away from that was, instead of starting people, before we'd have like one intro week where we'd start them at either a lower number of sets or like a few reps short. So like, to give you a random cherry picked example, uh, let's say the terminal reps for 80% of 1RM would be 6. Now, obviously, 8 would be failure. So we'd stop at 6. So an intro week would be 5 reps at 80%. And the thought was like, okay, well, if we don't walk it back much further, they might be adapting, but we're not even catching it because we're not even giving people a chance to have that incremental period. So maybe we don't even need to go that hard. So why don't we intro them over a longer period of time? Why don't we make it much more incremental? So now the approach has become literally the first 4 weeks of a block are an intro, and it's 4 reps shy of that. So if someone is doing a day where they're 80%, instead of starting them at 6 reps, that would be the last week of the block. We'd be starting them more like 2 reps. And then the next week we'd add a rep, and the next week we'd add a rep. So we're giving people time to acclimate. It also allows you to add in sets a lot more easily and fluidly to where they can tolerate that at a much lower threshold. So by the time they're getting to that closer to 9 RPE range, they've already adapted to that amount of sets. It's a much better incremental exposure. Plus, you can catch in that time, did they adapt just from this ramp, from doing less? So it answers the question of, is less more? Can we do less? Can we still get gains doing less? It didn't, it hasn't been mind-blowing. I'd say it's made the intervention a lot more sustainable, but certainly haven't gotten these mind-blowing new results by doing less and getting more. I wish that was the case. I want to be able to promise people that. Unfortunately, that's just not something that you see in biology anywhere.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think there's ever a point where less can be more in like terms of resensitization? Like if someone's doing 50,000 pounds of tonnage and then they plateau on that, do you think there's a way it could work where you're doing that, it plateaus, you pull back to maybe 30,000 pounds for a while. Then once you go back to the 50, you can push past that plateau. Have you guys experimented with that at all? Or is it always just kind of, you're going to have to push beyond?
I think those are so hard of questions to answer both practically and experimentally, because I could think of like 10 possible explanations for why that person could get stronger without it being a resensitization effect. I think you're talking about people who they have stressors outside of training. Your body is responding to stressors beyond just mechanical loading. There's emotional stressors, there's professional stressors, there's people undersleeping, there's people who might not be fueling appropriately. So that's a really hard experiment to control all those variables and then say, was it just that workload drop that did it? I also think you could say, was that load way too high for them? And then once you brought them more to an appropriate one, you actually let them sort of, you let the super compensation, the adaptation happen versus just burying them in too much work constantly. So do I think it's possible to have a pullback and jump in progress? I do, but I'd be a lot less likely to say that that's resensitization. I think there's other factors at play there, and I think that can make people's belief a lot more misleading. Like, oh, I pulled back, and it must have been that I was, that I was doing way too much, or I think you can attach very appropriate conclusions to that, just because, like I said, there's so many things. I think that's the most difficult part of coaching, is that you're trying to control so many variables beyond just the programming.
Yeah. And I think that's important too. There's so many factors that go into it. If you did pull back and you made progress, whether it was because you resensitized or it was because you were just overdosed before and you maybe let some injuries heal or whatever it was, the why is obviously important to some extent to make it repeatable. But as long as you have a process that's working and you're making progress, even if you don't know exactly why, and you're making the progress, that's all you really need to know, and then just continue learning from there. But so far, we've kind of touched the volume, the intensity. How does frequency play into this? Is it kind of, I know there's kind of two schools of thoughts where some people think you're only adding a day of frequency for a lift whenever you just need to have it to add in more volume. Are you in that school of thought, or are you more in the let's do squat more times a week to practice it because there's just a benefit to higher frequency in general and spread your volume out?
I think it's kind of both. I think we know from motor learning that repeating a task more often tends to improve your performance of it. So I think and we know that, the initial strength gains are, any person who reads a foundational textbook in exercise physiology, like, the initial gains are neural in nature. Well, like, that's not news to anybody, but the reality is there's a reason your nervous system is learning how to more appropriately fire, motor units to recruit, to be more efficient. So I do think you can still get effect out of that by, yes, performing higher frequency. I also think that the second one is true as well, there is a saturation point. At some point, most people don't live the lives where they can perform 10 sets and have it continue to be quality work. And the research does give us some insight there, where it seems that, like, beyond 5 sets, it seems that you kind of start to go off of a cliff. And again, to pull back to, pharmacology references, this is what we see in dose response to even drugs as well, is like, it's sort of like an S. It starts at a baseline and you kind of have this climbing response, and then it just plateaus, and you really just get a lot more side effects, a lot more of the negative, and a lot less of the benefit at a certain point. So it seems that, around 5 seems to be the area of, at least with the research that I've seen, the most up to date that I'm aware of, seems to be the ceiling where you've sort of achieved max benefit. Now, I don't think that means that necessarily is the most you should ever do. I think there are some cases where you might need to do a little more. Those might be more fringe cases. But I do think once you've sort of reached that saturation point, it just also makes sense to add another day and more frequency, because it's not going to hurt you. And really, some of the best gains I've seen with people in short periods, like Leah's a great example, going into Sheffield from 23 to 24, we really needed to add to her bench, and kind of trialed a couple different things out, and what we landed upon was benching every day. And you see a lot of the best benchers now. I know Meg Scanlon benches, I believe, every day. I think Corolla benches something like every day. I think Agata has extremely high frequency. There's really no free lunch, so to speak. So there definitely is something to the higher frequency. I just think the best way to get there is to incrementally get yourself there. I think everybody looks at it and says, oh, these high level lifters are all doing this every day and I'm benching 1 day a week, so I'm just going to go straight to 7. That's totally inappropriate. I do think at least work yourself there, try to make gains as long as you can on whatever you're doing, and then only increase when you have to. Don't just do it because you see the strongest people doing it. They've most likely worked themselves there or learned the hard way not to jump right to that. Because I know from even speaking to Agata is that, she was doing SPD, I think 7 days a week or something. And then she kind of changed that intervention and seemingly did get less or more. I don't think she's doing less, but I think it's more strategically built for the week's training.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, because if you're making progress and your goal in powerlifting is to make progress, that is the absolute worst time to get greedy and change things up, because odds are you're going to change it and not make progress anymore. That's why people hire coaches. Progress isn't the easiest thing to come by at a certain point. So if you're in the sweet spot, my biggest advice to anyone that asks me, just write it out. Don't change up anything. You can even find, top level powerlifters like that are benching 7 days a week. Oh, sorry, did I lose you there? Back to what I was saying though, like Laya or all these different ladies benching 7 days a week, they got there, but like you were saying, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what would work best whenever they started lifting. Even if you look at like John Hack, Taylor Atwood, all these people that are insanely crazy strong. It's not like they just started doing SPD 7 days a week and got there in a year. So if you start doing SPD 7 days a week and you're totaling 1,000, you're probably not going to be at a 2K total in a year. It's probably going to take you closer to 5-10 years if you ever get there at all. So I think that's a really important thing to mention for sure.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing too is like Taylor's a great example. There's a reason he's not benching every day, because he hasn't had to. He doesn't have to. So he shouldn't. Like that was very case specific with Leah as well. Like we had to get her bench up in Sheffield in a short period of time in order for her to try to win a significant amount of money. That's very case specific. If that's not the case for you, you probably don't want to be making a jump like that,
Yeah, definitely. With that being said, to kind of like wrap up just the total frequency, intensity, volume thing, do you have any points of maybe what you thought going into this whole, like between the Smolov Shaco era and now, things that you've changed your mind on, or maybe it's just you believe them more firmly even now?
I mean, I'd say, to be honest, like I think a lot of people, I'm almost jealous of people who have enormous conviction in their methodology, because to me, I still feel like I'm learning and I still feel like the work is being perfected. And that's a big reason why I don't like screaming from the top of the mountain about like, this is the definitive way to train and this is the answer. Because I'm just not certain that we have that yet. And that's why there's so many methodologies and beliefs and approaches to training. I think there are certain things that tie the programs that work together, as I said before, but I think one of the things that I've had my mind maybe more a little opened about is exactly what we changed, which is that just because someone can tolerate a certain level of work doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do that much to keep them making progress. There definitely was a period where we would add sets in order to try to overreach somebody in a peak. And I think based upon the changes we made and seeing the practical results, I think we have been achieving more with less workload, with less volume. Like basically the structuring of the average, if I was to build like a template model of what most people do when they come and train with me, is the first 4 weeks of a block is usually rep ramping. Like I told you, you'll start off very sub max and then work the reps up until you hit the terminal reps. You could call it whatever you want. Like you could say it's RPE ramping, however you want to define that, it's fine. But ultimately what's happening on paper is Someone is incrementally doing a few more reps at a given intensity. And then the second half, I'm load ramping them. So I'm trying to have them incrementally increase the load each week until they either top out and we need to just hold for a little bit, or they go the entire duration of the block and they keep adding 2.5, 5 kilos every week. That has allowed me to kind of much better see the role of the intensity end of it, more so than if we just indiscriminately said, okay, we want to produce more results, let's add another set. And I think a part of that is, it's like you're bringing a torch to a knife fight. Like, you're doing probably a lot more than is necessary to get the job done, because if you had a set and it's 5 reps at 80% of a given weight, you're adding a couple thousand more pounds of volume to that session, versus if you're just adding 2.5 kilos for that week across whatever those 4 or 5 sets, it's significantly less, like 20, 30 pounds, or it could be 50 to 100 pounds. That's an order of magnitude different. So I think it's more appropriate. It allows you to see more in a more refined way how much really is necessary, versus, like I said, bringing a torch to a knife fight, whatever analogy you want to use. I'd say that's been the biggest eye-opening thing for me. And then the experience with Leah going into Sheffield on that bench, because I think to a degree it was not performed how it was intended on her end. But I had her do double sessions 4 days a week. So it ended up being 8 total bench sessions within a week. We didn't get the results we wanted, and I think she performed, because she was stacking the sessions instead of doing them separated out. She would do like 12 sets of bench in one session versus 6 sets in the AM and then 6 sets in the PM. Either way, though, practically the results were much better when we brought her up to the much higher frequency bench program versus the much higher volume one. So she did a lot less volume on the daily benching program, but made much better results. So obviously, it's not just volume that matters. Her average intensity was way higher when she did that too.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier on just not being so strong in your convictions of training and how you're kind of jealous of people like that. I totally know what you mean, but I think it's very evident by just listening to you talk about that by not being so strong in them, that's probably why you've continued to learn and have good success coaching. Because if you were a person that was just insanely confident, you were doing exactly the perfect thing 10 years ago, you wouldn't have learned anything in the last 10 years, and you wouldn't have been able to get yourself, other lifters, etc., beyond plateaus. I think I almost have that to like a fault, where I, on a daily basis, like just have a new idea pop into my mind. I'm sure you're similar. You're just always thinking about this stuff. And I'll be like, oh, I have my training log from like 8 years ago. I'm going to go find it on that specific day and like literally check if this idea in my head lines up with what happened then. Because like when you're 15, you start out training and you don't understand, like, man, I'm fatigued today. Like, why is my performance bad? And you just don't understand what's happening. And then eventually later on, you understand these things that you've learned in the last 8 years. A lot of times I'll go look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, like it makes sense now. I'm like, I wish I could tell my younger self all this advice. But like, if I thought that I was doing the right thing, then I never would have gotten to where I am now.
Yeah, I think it depends upon what your endpoint is. For me, my endpoint is to understand as deeply as I can. I think that requires you to try to put your ego aside. I think if it's just look how good I am and then talk about how great I am, you can very easily just get stuck in this is the way and the only way, and there's no possibility that it could be anything else. I think, though, to speak to what you just said, the way people conceptualize training and progress, I think, is an important touch point too, because I think people have this expectation that progress is going to be linear on nearly every timeline. Like from week to week, you're going to get a little stronger, or from month to month. And the reality is, and this is really what extremely high frequency programs show you, is that progress looks a lot more like a stock ticker. It's a lot more volatile. So you have to look at the trend lines, not necessarily the individual data points. And it's just like tracking your body weight. Like someone could panic because their body weight spiked from Monday to Tuesday. And then by the time they get to Sunday, they're down in weight and waist measurement. And if you check their body composition, they'd probably be down in body fat as long as they were in a deficit, because you have all these factors that induce volatility into that. Same thing with performance. Performance is never this flat line that doesn't deviate. You have a ton of volatility because there's so many variables involved in how you perform. But it's also true, like I said, Mike Zordos and I tracked. We would do crazy programs. There was a point where I did SBD for 90 days straight. Mike daily squatted for like, I don't know, 3 months or something. And we kept all of our data from our daily maxes. And it's exactly what you saw, as you saw tons of volatility. The trend line was up. But if you looked at any given day and panicked, you just stop and say, this doesn't work. So you have to have the confidence to see something through. You also have to, I think one of the things that I see in the average gym goer, but also in the average powerlifter, is they program hop. They don't give anything enough time to work and see it through. And they're constantly chasing perfect, and they're actually missing what is effective. So that they don't make progress because they're jumping and trying to change and chase the new thing every month or two. The reality is, in order to really definitively know and get your answer on like, is this working well for you or not, you have to give it time. And that's the big thing. Like I try to get across to people, even when they start, is like the first 4 weeks, I'm assessing your baseline. I'm just seeing how you respond to this initial baseline dosing of volume, intensity, frequency, so on. My intent is to get you stronger within definitely the first 8 weeks. But in the beginning, I just want to see how you tolerate this and respond to this, so I can at least then see what needs to change and move. So that requires some patience. And I think if you're looking for somebody to give you the silver bullet, I think that's a bit dangerous and impatient, because the reality is, like, this isn't an emergency. It's not like you're going into cardiac arrest or anything. Like, you have, especially of young lifters, if you're in your 20s, even kind of 30s, like you have time. Like there's going to be more powerlifting meets. You don't have to increase. Maybe Sheffield changes that sense of urgency a little more than now, but like, what are you going to get? A participation medal, a plastic trophy? Like, take your time, get the answers, question things, try things, experiment. Like nearly everything I've learned is through a ton of just tinkering and self-experimentation, just like you're talking about. Is like the only way you can really own that knowledge is if you test it yourself and give it time and control the variables. So you're, Mike Teixeira calls it separating the noise from the signal. You need to make sure that you're doing that appropriately.
Yeah, I think that sums it up really well. I always have to remind myself, because my emotions are so heavily attached to my training, that you kind of do have to separate the noise from the signal. Of, if I go in and have a bad training session, it's really easy just to be thinking about that the rest of the day, ruining it. And even though training is such an important part of my life, I have to remember, this is just lifting weights. Like, this really does not matter in the grand scheme of things. It matters to no one else but me. But also, you quite literally cannot get to better times with understanding your training and better PRs without actually having made mistakes in your programming and your training. And I always remind myself, like, oh, I made that mistake and maybe it ate up a couple months of progress, and now I'm here. I could have been here sooner. But I'm like, no, not really, because at some point I wouldn't have known that the grass is not greener, and I would have tried this thing out anyway. And in 10 years, like, there's realities where the water is a little bit muddied in one place rather than another. And I tried some experiment that failed in a year instead. But like, you're probably going to get to the same place in the end. And like, whether you do a lot of those mistakes in the beginning or near the end, it doesn't really matter. Like, you're going to get where you're going. It doesn't really matter regardless, if you see what I'm saying here.
Yeah, I think an important thing too is, like, imagine if, God came down from the sky and said, this is the perfect training program, and you just followed it mindlessly, maybe it'd be great to get those gains, but I do believe at some point it's not going to be fulfilling, because you just listened, you just obeyed. Like, you don't really have ownership of that knowledge. You don't really know what doesn't work. You just know what you've been told and that you followed. So I think that's fine if that's all you're looking for. But if you really want to learn and you want to improve and you want to be able to troubleshoot, not just use ChatGPT to write a training program, like, I think you need to have those mistakes in that database and all of that context to be able to weigh against. And that's really where experience matters. It's really not just program writing. It's like every individual person is an individual experiment. And I think the most fascinating ones to me are when things don't go as predicted. And it's like, okay, what went wrong there? Let me run diagnostics and see. So I think that's super important, is like, no prep is perfect. I don't think for any lifter, despite even the best outcome scenarios, the prep has ever gone perfectly. So you need to be able to be flexible and dynamic and agile. And the only way that happens is if you're able to be cognitively flexible too. And that, again, that comes with, like you said, taking it as, I think there's a difference between saying you had a bad session and being like, and sulking about it, versus like, I had a bad session and then going into problem solving mode. Why did that happen? What could I correct about that? What can I improve about it? Because one is a victim kind of way of doing it, where you're really not going to improve from it. The second, it will actually lead you down a better and greater path.
Yeah, and I think a big thing with that too is just, there is a reason for everything, but you might not be able to fully find that reason. Like, there's some stuff going on in your body. You had a bad training session today. There's a reason, but like, there's just things you simply aren't in control of. It could be as simple as just getting sick and it's going to hurt your session and you're not super aware of whatever. But at the end of the day, if you were given that God-given program and you had perfect outside variables, I think for a lot of us, especially in the coaching realm, we're really interested in this because it is so numbers based and we're trying to, like, scratch that itch. And that's why we really like it. We like figuring out how it works and running experiments. And if we were just given that, like, we'd be out of the job, and that's not even that cool.
Let's be real. If that happened, people still wouldn't believe it anyway. Even if
Yeah.
Jesus himself was like, hey, this is the best program, people would be like, no, I don't believe it.
Yeah, maybe there's someone out there that has the perfect program. It works for everyone. And they're like, guys, come on, follow it. And they got 13 followers, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
This was a great podcast, though. I really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to tell people where they can find you? I guess all aspects, nutrition, coaching, Instagram, whatever you want to plug.
Sure. So Instagram, you will be supremely disappointed, but you're welcome to follow me. It's just at Ben Esgro. Anybody local to Northeast PA or Scranton, I am a co-owner in a gym called Hammer Forge Strength, formerly known as Peffer's, Peffer Athletic Club. So if anybody ever wanted to come in and train, you should definitely stop by there. We have all the best competition equipment and plates. I have a supplement company called Elemental Formulations. That's elemental.fit. We will be restocking our very long awaited restock of our pre-workout. So if anybody has used or is looking for a pre-workout, that will be back in stock soon. And then the strength guys. For everything nutrition, coaching, and programming, I work with the strength guys. So thestrengthguys.com, and then you could reach me through there, through either directly through the website or just sending an email on the contact form on the website.
Great. And I do have to give a special thank you to Jason Trombley as well, because he helped me come up with like half the questions for this. We were DMing back and forth. So yeah, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Ben.